Hello friends, this is Odds, and today we're going to talk about every killer in Dead by Daylight. We'll discuss their strengths, evaluate their weaknesses, and ultimately compare them and try to place them on a tier list, which is very hard, but we'll try. As I said, this is for the upcoming 5.30 patch, and I'm assuming that you're playing on PC. Cosmetics are, we're only going to rank them on their ability to consistently win, which is 3 or 4 kills in my book in advance. You could go to any and all maps, you have access to any and all perks without restrictions, and of course, all of the add-ons for each killer are on the table. And that as such, you have reached a high MMR, which is a hidden number that supposedly makes you good at the game. The typical perks, the typical items, the typical map offerings, that meta, which is very prevalent, that's what you'll be going up against on average. Also, on average, you will have some solo players, which is, sometimes happens, some full survivor friends parties, and something in between. Here's the tier list as it stands. Some of these placements are really, really hard to judge, but if you don't want to watch the entire video or even use the timestamps down below to skip to whichever part you're interested, the comment section is out of the open. Just type why I'm wrong and why you disagree with everything. You don't even need to watch the video, right? Let's talk about the nurse. Why is the nurse consistently placed as the #1 killer in most tiers? Windows, pallets, different elevations, different floors, walls with breakable walls. All of those things other killers have to play around for the most part. The nurse, with her ability to teleport through them, can almost always ignore. Although not unbeatable, a good team that splits up, that makes her have a hard time landing hits. So she's definitely strong, has very few weaknesses in terms of maps that she can go to. And on top of that, this new patch has just made her better. Next up is the Blight. Starting at yellow add-ons and all the way up to iridescence. These add-ons are really powerful. And some of these add-ons, the ones that increase his speed, make him a very agile killer who can easily outspeed a nurse when it comes to closing the gap. And then you've got add-ons that make survivors slower, that reveal their aura, that make them going down in one hit. And these add-ons are just ridiculous. They are very easy to use for the most part. Hard to predict, hard to understand from the survivor side. There's not a lot of feedback to them. Very strong. In my opinion, nowadays, probably the second strongest killer in the game. Although, maybe you could argue that. Next up is the Spirit. Standing still no longer works as a mind game. If you stand still, the survivors will not hear your power. On top of not being able to mind game by staying still, you will no longer be able to grab survivors that are working on a generator or going for an unhook or doing a totem or any other action like that the way you could before. But here's the thing, it is still a vague idea. If you hear, from a survivor point of view, if you hear a spirit come from the left, you don't know if she's inside the shack or outside the shack. There's no visual indication, only audio indication right now. Overall, she's powerful, just not as overwhelmingly powerful and overwhelmingly difficult to deal with from the survivor side as before. Next up is Hag. As a Hag is the fact that when you go into a match, the survivors do not know that it's a Hag. If you set up a perimeter, a web of traps, if you will, successfully, most teams will struggle to, even if you lose 2 or 3 generators for that, as long as you set up a web of traps and you have one person on the hook in the first half of the game, that will make most teams have a really hard time playing against you. In public games, survivors panic, they step into your web and they go down immediately, or you hit them and then you corral them towards the rest of your traps. Even if they put up a bit of a resistance, you are still very likely to catch one of them sooner or later. And even though it's a bit of a stretch, I still think that she's very powerful. We have the killers in the A tier, starting with the Oni. This killer is incredibly unpredictable, has a ridiculously good potential to snowball once he has his power, being able to down multiple survivors very quickly. #1, his mobility works regardless of map. Unlike other killers, he doesn't need line of sight, he doesn't mind bushes, he doesn't mind fences, he doesn't mind obstacles. His mobility is really good. And no matter how bad of a game you have, as long as you control the map to some degree, you almost always have the potential to completely make the team crumble. And I think that's what makes him a very solid pick for the A tier. The Huntress has a really hard time finding synergy with perks. She cannot use stealth because of her big lullaby. And because of her low mobility, many perks that give information are not as useful or cannot be taken advantage of as easily with Huntress. But despite all of that, with the Huntress, you have a killer with that tremendously high skill ceiling, one that only seems to get higher and higher. You see a player of Huntress with several thousand hours, and each of those hours shows. You make a tiny mistake, you take a hell state loss. But other than that, if you're going for reliable perks, I still think she's really powerful. The play has always been strong, but she's had a lot of things holding her back. And in this next patch, some of those things are gone. If you puke on a generator and the survivor has to work on that generator while it's still infected, the infection rate basically duplicates. And that is insane. That means that your ability to keep people, to make people injured without even being close to them, so that means that survivors will either need to be injured even more or will need to cleanse even more. Most of them, as a result of her changes, are now stronger or as strong as before. So a very confident place in her right here. After Plague, we come to Pyramid Head. It's not any higher. You have a killer that moves at 115, so he has at least normal mobility, that can basically get hits in almost any loop. In fact, if you have survivors close up, you can get hits on multiple survivors at a time, which makes him extremely deadly. Coming out of basement, he can hit down the stairs, or unhooking in front of him, he can hit both survivors. Uncaging in front of him, he can hit both survivors or more. So he's a killer that is really, really threatening from close up, who has incredible, almost limitless possibilities to get hits in almost any loop in the game. Next up is Twins. Is try to get a survivor injured and then send out Victor to down them. And that is better, but you have the two problems. Number one, you need to hit a survivor with your basic attack, which is hard sometimes. It's not necessarily easy. And then after you down that survivor, you need to hope that the survivor is not too far away. If the survivor is too far away, they could get picked up with Unbreakable. They could hop into a locker, making Victor basically useless because you're too far with Charlotte. Lots of things can go wrong in that plan. So what ultimately needs to be done is for you to make the best possible decision at any given time. If you are amazing at Twins and you make all of the right decisions and you bring a build that sustains your playstyle, it's possible that Twins could be a little bit higher than I'm rating them here. Next up, we have Cannibal. Cannibal is a very straightforward killer. He has the ability to insta-down survivors. In fact, if multiple survivors are grouped up, he can insta-down multiple of them. With this killer, there is no strategy invented yet that will allow survivors to realistically get away. He can shred through pallets relatively fast. He can shred through breakable walls relatively fast as well, which I guess comes in handy sometimes. For windows, you can run Bamboozle, which is a really good perk on him, and shut down preemptively windows that would be troublesome, and now force them to use pallets. Unfortunate decisions, or you go to a really tough map, you do have a very good chance of beating almost any team with Cannibal. Next up is Nemesis. You have an ability that hits survivors. Survivors get a speed boost from it, and they don't even get injured, which means you have to hit them 3 times. And not only that, by using vaccines and forcing you to hit them 3 times again. So why is this killer not the worst killer in the game? If you have Marvin's Blood, which is a yellow affordable add-on, and when you get to tier 2, things change dramatically. You become the best pallet breaker in the game by far. Nemesis is disgustingly good at windows. Yes, he does need to hit you 3 times, but he's going to hit you 3 times almost anywhere. But he is a killer with a tremendously high skill ceiling that really, really rewards you for practicing him pinhead. Why isn't this killer even higher on the list? You need to be able to hit people with your chain, which is difficult. It's like hitting someone with a chainsaw with the hillbilly. It's hard. You need to be able to place the portals right, very much like the nurse needs to teleport right. You need to play your normal M1s well. You will be punished very, very harshly if you are not very good at any of these things. If you don't have these very, very strong add-ons, I feel like you might struggle otherwise with Pinhead. Overall, I think Pinhead is probably poised to remain around this place. And next, we get to Demogorgon. He doesn't have an incredible threat of insta-downing. He doesn't have any crazy mobility. but he is somewhere in between. He can use his portals for mobility, he can use his portals for moderate chances to detect and stop survivors from doing certain objectives. His chase tool is pretty adequate. He will get hits on greedy survivors at pallets, loops, windows, if they allow it. And you don't have any insane ability to snowball through use of your power or to bring the game to a halt. So it will ultimately come down to you being consistently really good at dealing with loops and having the survivors make a few mistakes. If you decide to play him despite all of this, I respect you. And next we have the Deathslinger. He has been arguably the one that has received the biggest rework. He now has to aim for at least 0.4 seconds before he can shoot. The problem with the lack of insta hits is that many of the quick reactions that you could do before are now no longer possible. So if you see a survivor go through a wall and you spot a little hole, before you could immediately shoot, catch a survivor and either injure or drag them around for a hit if you didn't want to break the chain. And that is now impossible, but one that has fallen from the top of the B tier some time ago. Next up, we have the Hillbilly. Survivors that have a brain that play well will make Windows a nightmare. That's why many Hillbillies bring Bamboozle. Will make playing around pallets difficult. Not only will you need to manage your overheating, you will need to charge perfectly, you will need to flick perfectly, you will need to not hit the edges of the obstacles perfectly, or else you have a very punishing stun. So compared to other killers like Cannibal or Nemesis that are really straightforward and you can play well and immediately add pressure, on Hillbilly you don't need to play well, you need to play almost flawlessly or else risk losing everything. By any means, he's still a decent killer with a considerable power to him. Next up is Trickster. So he's very good at defending, he's very good at catching survivors in the open. In low loops where his knives can go over obstacles, he's basically uncontrollable. What are the negatives to this killer? He also doesn't get around long obstacles very fast because of his speed. And that means that a survivor's running you around tall obstacles like, say, shack, long jungle gyms, you cannot deal with them very well. You put a couple knives, they go behind the wall, you stop slowing yourself down, you catch up, they go behind another wall, and at this point, they are winning. You cannot use your ability in such scenarios, and has such high highs and such low lows, it's real hard for me to place him on a tier list. If I had to give it my best shot, it would be right here. The next killer is Wraith. If you get a grab on a survivor, awesome. If you get an ambush hit on a survivor and then they go down because they're out of position, brilliant. But other than those things, once you engage in a normal chase, you are perfectly predictable. If a survivor has a flashlight and you get burned out of it, bad stuff. If you get stunned while in cloak, bad stuff. If a survivor abuses some of the tricks that you can do against Wraith to deny him of some of his power usages, not great. And if you get good at Wraith, you'll have a very consistent killer that can do okay in most scenarios. Next up, we have the Doctor. Unless you're running a specific add-on, shocking a survivor has a considerable delay to it. Many times you will do a perfectly reasonable shock on a survivor that should prevent them from vaulting a window and giving you a hit, maybe an insta-down. But because they live in God knows where and they have God knows what Wi-Fi, they will vault the window. And that is incredibly annoying. And he works well on a variety of maps, but if I were to play Doctor against decent survivors and I knew that I went to a map like Batham, I would already be sweating. And next we get to Legion. Ultimately, it comes down to this question. Once you have everybody injured, or as many people injured as possible, can you get downs quickly? And if you minimize the time that it takes for you to get that down, and if you do a lot of damage with your initial injure, Legion is quite strong. The problem, of course, comes when survivors stay injured, they have a strong map, they use it well, they don't allow you to get multiple people injured. If by any chance you manage to get all of them injured, they understand that they don't need to panic. They don't waste 2 minutes healing everyone, they just heal 1, maybe 2 people. And that 1 or 2 people will be the person going for the rescue. And everybody else will stay on gens and be safe and play it super safe. If they ever get some quality of life changes or their add-ons are a little bit more fun, I'm sure many people would welcome. Next up, we have Ghostface, indicator that he is Ghostface at the start of the match. He doesn't have any crazy abilities. You will never play against a Ghostface and be like, oh, it's another Ghostface with this add-on, like you do with Blight, for example. So he's quite mild in his kit. Ultimately, though, what happens when you play against a Survivor team that is well aware, that is not immediately caught off guard, or that recovers really well from it? This killer is really hard. And ultimately, if you do not ambush someone, you need to chase them down. And this killer just doesn't have any crazy tools to chase people down. Even though some maps are really, really good for you, most of them are not. In fact, his best map, Hawkins, is going away soon, unfortunately. Next up is the Nightmare. And he is a killer that has dropped so dramatically, you almost... As for the snares, they are definitely useful in chase. But much like Clown, which we'll get to, they just force survivors to be a little bit greedy and take strong windows and drop pallets early. And guess what? They can do that because many maps have an abundance of strong windows next to strong pallets, and they will not necessarily miss those pallets because they'll find others. Or by the time you get rid of the pallets, the gens will have popped. He's nowhere near as powerful as he used to be. Ultimately, I think it will come down to how smart the survivors are when you play that you're playing against. If you are playing against good survivors, I think Freddy should be quite the struggle. Next up is Clown. If you throw a good bottle, a survivor almost always takes a hit in a loop unless a strong pallet unless they are at an amazing window. The map is something that the Clown needs to mind a lot. If the generators are really far and spread out, nothing you can do about that with Clown. If you have a map with very, very many strong pallets and very many strong windows, if your perks fail and they bring strong medkits, strong items, strong perks themselves, your odds of success greatly diminish. That has some fun add-ons and some fun cosmetics so you can look like a chicken. So that alone makes him S tier in my heart, even though he's probably one of the weaker killers right now. Next up, we have the Pig, with only changes to her add-ons. Interesting iridescent add-ons, one of which is really, really powerful, allows everyone to start off with a bear trap, which makes her early game really scary. The big deal is that her stealth is slow. Unfortunately, the Pig has an ambush chasing power that is hard to utilize and hard to get value out of in many, many maps, in many, many situations. The problem, of course, is the bottlenecking that her lack of chasing power imposes. If you do not get downs, you cannot slow down the game. So even though she is comparatively weaker because of her ambush not being all that strong in chase, she's still fun. You should still give it a shot. Next up is Trapper. Picking up a lot of your traps and setting them down requires a lot of forethought, requires incredibly deep knowledge of the map, requires great anticipation of where the chases will take place. You can waste your time a lot for little to no value. So this is a killer that will provide very inconsistent results due to the nature of his power. Survivors can still dead hard through your traps. Survivors that are smart can still disarm your traps if they see you put them down. If you're playing against a team, survivors can find your trap with maps. They can see you put them down and call them out. And certain traps, if you know they're there, you don't need to disarm them. With Trapper, it is a bit of a gamble. And next, we get to Michael. And while some of the add-ons are honestly quite strong, with the Tombstone piece in particular being quite busted, if you don't really use and abuse these really, really well, Michael is just a really, really average killer. Mostly predictable, can be looped even at his strongest, requires perks to slow down the game, starts at a net negative at the beginning. His tier 3 has a slightly bigger launch, which is helpful but not absolutely game-changing, considering other killers like Nemesis, especially due to his early game being tough. Michael is perhaps the weaker killer of the cast right now. I know there will be some disagreements. I think it's really hard. Some of these I'm honestly not super sure myself, but this is the best I've been able to come up with. So thank you so much for watching if you watched all the way until the end. And even if not, I appreciate your time still. I'll see you in the next one.